The afternoon sun casts a faint glow over Washington, D.C. Karoline Levit, 27 years old, the youngest White House press secretary in history, was resting in her luxurious apartment near the White House. The small silver cross on the collar of her navy blue blazer, a mark of faith from New Hampshire, glimmered as she stood up. Suddenly her phone rang. It was President Trump. "Caroline, there's a religious case at the D.C. local court. A group of Christians is suing because they were banned from praying in public. Go now, observe, and report." His voice was urgent, leaving her no time to think. Caroline's tidy apartment reflected her discipline. Documents were neatly stacked, and her business attire was prepared in advance. Today she opted for a simpler style, a blazer, white shirt, and black pants. But she still wore the cross out of habit. As Trump's spokesperson, she was used to handling crises, but this was different. It touched her personal faith. Caroline quickly jumped into her sleek black SUV, speeding through the crowded traffic. NPR blared the news, but she turned it off, focusing on the unexpected task ahead. Before we dive into the story, if you're enjoying this, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Caroline arrives at the D.C. local court. Karoline Levit pushed through the glass doors of the D.C. local court, stepping into a stifling, chaotic space. The murmurs of the crowd rang out like an off-key symphony. Citizens awaited minor cases, traffic violations, contract disputes, mixed with the clacking of keyboards from the clerk's corner. She glanced at her watch. 2:53 p.m. Just a few minutes remained before the religious case hearing began, the one Trump wanted her to monitor closely. Caroline chose a hard wooden chair in the middle row, sat down, and opened her phone to take notes. The silver cross on her neck glimmered under the fluorescent lights, but she didn't notice the eyes around the room fixating on her. The courtroom wasn't large, but its clutter made it feel oppressive. A middle-aged man in a t-shirt printed with "I am king" sat a few seats away, fiddling with his phone. To her right, a young woman wearing an oversized necklace, shinier than a chandelier, whispered to her lawyer. Caroline frowned. Clearly, dress code rules here weren't strict. She focused on her task, documenting details of the Christian group suing the government for banning public prayer in a local park. This was an issue Trump wanted to turn into a symbol for conservatives, and she was his eyes here. Judge Charles Hargrove enters. The wooden door behind the judge's bench swung open, and Judge Charles Hargrove stepped out. At 62, he carried a rigid demeanor. His salt and pepper hair was combed back, wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose, and his black robe pressed flat as if just ironed. The crowd fell silent as he sat. His cold, sharp eyes scanned the room. "All rise," shouted James Wilson, a tall, stern-faced bailiff. Caroline stood with the others, phone still in hand, her gaze studying Hargrove. He banged his gavel on the desk, signaling the start of the session. "This is a court of law, not a place to show off personality," he declared, his voice deep but cutting like a knife. Hargrove began calling cases swiftly. A man fined for parking in the wrong spot. $50, no argument. A woman late on rent payments, a light warning. Caroline took notes, noticing Hargrove ran things like a machine, efficient but cold. She glanced at the man in the "I am king" t-shirt. He stood to present a neighbor dispute, and Hargrove didn't mention his flashy shirt. The woman with the oversized necklace was called up too. No word about her jewelry. Caroline frowned again. Something was off. Then Hargrove's eyes landed on her. He stopped mid-sentence, his hand flipping through papers, stalling. His eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses narrowed as if recognizing something. "Miss Levit," he said, his voice icy but with a hint of hesitation, clearly having recognized the familiar face from White House press briefings. Caroline looked up, unsurprised, standing with natural composure. The crowd turned to look at her, murmurs rising as a few others recognized her too. "That cross," Hargrove pointed at her neck, his tone rigid. "It doesn't belong here. The courtroom is a neutral place, not somewhere to display faith." Caroline glanced around. No prohibitive sign hung on the walls. She replied, her voice clear and confident. "I'm Karoline Levit, White House press secretary, here to observe a case for work. This is a personal item, protected by the First Amendment, violating no rules." Hargrove squinted, his face tightening. Work? This isn't the place to wear that and cause trouble. The courtroom is neutral, not a church. He banged his gavel again, as if to emphasize his authority. James Wilson, the bailiff, stood near the bench, tilting his head to observe. Mrs. Thompson, the middle-aged court clerk with her hair in a tight bun, stopped typing, glancing at Karoline with curiosity. The man in the T-shirt and the woman with the oversized necklace whispered to each other, clearly surprised that Hargrove didn't notice them. Karoline stood still, gripping her phone tightly. She realized instantly Hargrove wasn't just targeting her, but the cross itself, a symbol he seemed to despise. "Sir, I have the right to wear it under the First Amendment," she said, her voice calm but firm. Hargrove cut her off immediately. "Don't lecture me on the law. Step up to the bench now." The crowd held its breath. Karoline took a deep breath, stepping up to the defendant's stand. Her heels clicked lightly on the old wooden floor of the D.C. local court. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. The silver cross on her navy blazer collar glimmered under the lights like a small flame amid an approaching storm. The showdown judge Charles Hargrove sat elevated, his eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses narrowing further, his face growing red with anger. "So what are you doing here with that thing, Miss Levit?" he asked, his voice low but sharp as a razor, clearly trying to maintain an air of authority. "Sir, I'm here on duty and have the right to wear it," she replied, still clutching her phone, her thumb discreetly switching on the recording mode. Hargrove banged his gavel on the desk, the sound echoing through the room. "I've seen plenty of people like you, thinking faith gives them the right to disrupt anywhere. This is my courtroom, and I say it's not allowed." He leaned forward, gripping the gavel tightly. "Do you know this behavior is contempt of court?" Karoline furrowed her brow, quickly glancing around the room. The man in the "I Am King" t-shirt sat there unnoticed. The woman with the oversized necklace whispered to her lawyer, ignored. Yet her tiny cross was the problem. "Sir, I'm not disrupting anything," she replied, her voice still steady. "I'm here for work, and my attire doesn't affect anyone. If you have a specific ban, I'd like to see the written rule." Hargrove smirked, a cold, humorless grin. "A rule? I am the rule here. You walked into my courtroom with that, disrespecting the law, and now you dare demand a document?" He banged the gavel again, so hard that Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, stopped typing and looked up with concern. The crowd began to murmur. An older man in the back row shook his head, whispering to his neighbor, "That necklace over there's bigger." Why is no one saying anything? James Wilson, the bailiff, stood near the bench, tilting his head to observe. He'd worked here 15 years, and Hargrove's focus on Karoline felt familiar. Not the first time he'd seen this bias. Karoline took a deep breath, knowing a direct argument wouldn't sway Hargrove. She chose the long game. "Sir, if I've broken a rule, I have the right to a clear explanation," she said, her hands subtly adjusting her phone to ensure the recording didn't stop. Hargrove sneered, clearly taking her words as a challenge. "Explanation? Here's your explanation. I'm fining you $500 for contempt of court." He banged the gavel a third time, the sound ringing like a final verdict. The crowd gasped. $500? A young woman whispered to her friend. "Just for a cross?" The man in the "I Am King" t-shirt let out a small chuckle, but quickly silenced himself as Hargrove glared his way. "You'll pay today before you leave," Hargrove continued, his tone like a lecture. "Maybe this fine will teach you to respect order. This isn't a church, Miss Levit, nor a stage for your performance." He leaned back, smug, as if he'd just won an unchallenged fight. Karoline stood still, her sharp eyes fixed on Hargrove. "Sir, I understand your ruling," she said, her voice even but laced with resolve. "But I have the right to ask, why aren't the others in this room with printed shirts and big necklaces fine too?" Hargrove's face flushed, his hand gripping the gavel until his knuckles whitened. "Don't change the subject," he shouted. "You're the only one here bold enough to bring a religious symbol into my courtroom. That's the difference." Karoline nodded slightly as if confirming her suspicions. She said no more, but her mind was clear. Hargrove wasn't just biased, he was targeting Christian faith deliberately. Mrs. Thompson resumed typing, but her fingers trembled. In her 12 years as Hargrove's clerk, she'd rarely seen him fined so harshly for something so trivial. James Wilson stood near the bench, arms crossed, his glance at Karoline carrying a hint of empathy. He'd watched Hargrove handle hundreds of cases, and this focus on the young woman stood apart. The crowd's whispers grew louder, some sneaking out phones despite the no filming rule. Karoline stood there, still holding her phone, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't just a fine. It was a chance to expose something bigger. "Are you done, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but cutting. Hargrove frowned, caught off guard by her composure. "Not yet," he replied. "You'll pay, and I'll move on with the session. Sit down." Karoline didn't sit. She stepped closer to the bench, resting her hand on its edge, her eyes never leaving Hargrove. "I'll pay," she said, her voice low but brimming with determination. "But we're not done here." Hargrove smirked again, but this time it faltered slightly. Karoline's triumph. Karoline Levit stood firm at the defendant's stand, her gaze locked on Judge Charles Hargrove. The silver cross on her navy blazer collar gleamed like a silent challenge. Hargrove had just fined her $500 for contempt of court, his face flushed red with triumph, his hands still gripping the gavel. The crowd in the D.C. local court held its breath, the murmurs fading. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, stopped typing, her anxious eyes darting between Karoline and Hargrove. James Wilson, the bailiff, stood with arms crossed, tilting his head as if anticipating something bigger. Hargrove broke the silence. "Did you hear me, Miss Levit? $500 payable today. Sit down. We have other business." He banged the gavel, signaling an end. But Karoline didn't budge. She took a deep breath, placed her hand on the bench's edge, and spoke, her voice clear, calm, yet sharp as a blade. "Sir, before I sit, I need to clarify a few things for the record." Hargrove frowned, caught off guard by her steadiness. "The record? You've got no right to demand anything here," he snapped, but his voice wavered, as if sensing something coming. Karoline gave a slight smile, not taunting, but the confidence of someone in control. She pulled a small, gold-gleaming card from her document bag and held it up for all to see. "I'm Karoline Levit, White House press secretary, serving under President Donald Trump. But what you don't know, Judge Hargrove, is that I don't just talk well, I know the law deeper than you might think." The crowd gasped. The man in the "I Am King" t-shirt gaped. The woman with the oversized necklace whispered to her lawyer. Hargrove froze, his hand on the gavel stilled midair. "That doesn't change the fact that you broke my rules," Hargrove muttered, his voice fading. But Karoline didn't let him regain his momentum. She stepped closer to the podium, her voice echoing throughout the room. "Your rules, or your personal bias. I'm here on the president's orders to observe a religious case. A group of Christians suing for their right to pray in public. This cross," she pointed to her neck, "is my religious freedom, protected by the First Amendment. You fine me for it, but do you know what the law says?" Hargrove's face reddened, trying to push back. "I don't need you teaching me the law. This is my courtroom, and I decide." Karoline cut him off, her voice firmer than ever. "You're wrong, sir. The law isn't yours alone. Let me remind you of Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus City of Hialeah, 1993. The Supreme Court ruled that banning religious symbols without just cause violates the Constitution. Do you have a just cause, or is it just because you don't like it?" The crowd fell dead silent. A few sneaked phone photos despite the rules. Hargrove opened his mouth but found no words. Mrs. Thompson held her breath, fingers hovering over the keys. James Wilson nodded slightly, eyes alight. He'd seen many cases, but never a defendant flipped the script this fast. Karoline pressed on, her voice like a rehearsed speech. "You fine me $500 for contempt, but I've got proof right here in this room. That man," she pointed to the "I Am King" t-shirt wearer, "wears a printed shirt, clearly against dress code, yet you said nothing. Her," she pointed to the woman with the big necklace, "she's got flashy jewelry, but you're silent. Only my cross, a Christian symbol, angered you. That's not law, sir. That's bias." Hargrove trembled, his face shifting from red to pale. You're slandering me," he stammered, his voice weak, unconvincing. Karoline didn't stop. She raised her phone. "I've recorded everything, from when you called me up to now. I've also texted the White House office, reporting this injustice. You want to find me? Fine. But this doesn't end here. The crowd erupted in whispers. Someone shouted, "She's right!" Another clapped, quickly hushed by James Wilson. Hargrove panicked, grasping for control. "Miss Levitt, I can withdraw the fine. No need to escalate this." He banged the gavel feebly, his voice shaky. But Karoline shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "No, sir. Withdrawing it because of who I am only proves you're more wrong. The issue isn't me. It's how you run this court. I demand you review the past 6 months' records, all fines tied to religious symbols. And I propose mandatory First Amendment training for court staff, including you." The courtroom exploded. The older man in the back stood, clapping, yelling, "That's right!" A young woman whispered, "Who is she?" "Amazing!" Mrs. Thompson typed furiously, capturing every word, her eyes gleaming as if witnessing history. James Wilson smiled discreetly. He'd known she was special from the start. Hargrove slumped into his chair, face ashen, hands trembling on the gavel. He looked at Karoline, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a defendant, but as a formidable foe. "You think I'm just a spokesperson?" Karoline said, her voice low but powerful. "But I've worked with President Trump through countless lawsuits, from elections to policy. I taught myself law to defend him, and now I'm using it to defend myself and others. You just made a big mistake, Judge Hargrove." She placed her White House card on the bench, stepped back, her eyes never leaving him. Hargrove opened his mouth but said nothing. He knew he'd crossed someone not just smart, but a legal genius. The crowd erupted again, scattered applause breaking out. Mrs. Thompson typed faster than ever, as if to preserve the moment forever. James Wilson stepped closer to the bench, his eyes full of respect for Karoline. Hargrove sat there, his authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. Karoline stood still, the cross still shining, no longer just a symbol of faith, but her flag of victory. The aftermath. Karoline Levitt stepped out of the D.C. local court, the late afternoon sun glinting off the silver cross on her navy blazer collar. The clock read 3:30 p.m., but the air inside had just exploded like a bomb. She paused at the glass doors, checking her phone. The recording had been sent to the White House office along with a brief message to Trump's advisor. "Hargrove fined me for the cross, handled it, next steps needed." She knew this wasn't just personal anymore. It was a chance for Trump and conservatives to score big. Inside the courtroom, the crowd was still buzzing. The older man in the back turned to his neighbor, voice trembling. "I've never seen anyone knock out a judge that fast." A young woman with her boyfriend whispered, "She's the White House press secretary. Incredible." Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, hurriedly printed the session transcript, her hands shaky as she processed what she'd witnessed. James Wilson, the bailiff, left the courtroom, phone in hand, calling a colleague. "You've got to hear this. A young woman just silenced Hargrove." The news began leaking out, spreading like wildfire through dry grass. The viral moment. Karoline hadn't even reached her car when her phone buzzed wildly. A notification from X. Number sign cross in court was trending. She opened the app and saw the first tweet from someone at the scene. "Judge fines White House press secretary $500 for wearing a cross. She fights back with the law, leaves him speechless." Cross in court. Within 10 minutes, hundreds of comments poured in. "Who is she? Unreal. Hargrove's done." A major conservative account tweeted, "Proof the system's against Christians. Thank you, Karoline Levitt." She gave a small smile, knowing this wave was just beginning. At 4 p.m., President Trump jumped in. He posted from his personal account, "Karoline Levitt, my amazing spokesperson, just taught a leftist judge a lesson on religious freedom. Legal genius. We won't let them suppress faith." The tweet racked up over 50,000 retweets in 30 minutes. Conservative outlets like Fox News pounced, running headlines. "White House press secretary faces off with judge over cross and wins big." Karoline got a call from Trump's senior advisor. "You did great," his voice beamed. "The president wants this amplified. Prep a statement." Hargrove's downfall. Meanwhile, Charles Hargrove sat alone in his office behind the bench, dim light casting shadows on his pale face. His phone rang non-stop. D.C. Judicial Council, reporters, even old colleagues. He silenced it, hands trembling as he held a cold coffee mug. The clash with Karoline hadn't just humiliated him in front of the crowd, it was spreading across the city. He muttered, "She's just a young girl. How did this happen?" But deep down, he knew he'd collided with something bigger than himself. The system changes. The next morning, the D.C. Judicial Council's office buzzed like a beehive. News of Karoline Levit and Judge Charles Hargrove had swept through Washington, forcing the council to launch an urgent investigation. Linda Martinez, a seasoned investigator with 20 years' experience, stood before a long table, spreading out dozens of case files from Hargrove's court. Her team had been working nonstop since 6 a.m. after receiving an official complaint from the White House office, filed by Karoline last night. "We've got 48 hours to report," Linda told her team, her voice firm. "Find everything tied to Hargrove in religious symbols." Karoline, meanwhile, sat in her White House office, prepping for tonight's press conference at Trump's command. She reviewed the courtroom recording, sending another email to his advisor. "I've got data from X, hundreds accusing Hargrove of bias. Push this hard." Her phone buzzed constantly, messages from lawyers, reporters, and supporters. A law student wrote, "You inspire me. Hargrove fined my mom for a cross once." Karoline smiled, knowing this was no longer just her fight. It had reached thousands. The investigation at the courthouse. Mrs. Thompson entered the investigation room, clutching her small notebook. "I've tracked 12 years with Hargrove," she told Linda, her voice shaky but resolute. "He always targeted religious symbols, crosses, hijabs, anything stand out. But crude shirts or loud jewelry, he let them slide." Linda flipped through the notebook, spotting dozens of cases. September 14th, 2024. Man with cross, fined $300 for disruption. October 20th, 2024. Muslim woman with hijab, fined $300 for disruption. October 20th, 2024. Muslim woman with hijab, fined $200 for inappropriateness. Linda frowned. "This is gold." "Thank you." James Wilson showed up too, offering a handwritten statement. "I've been a bailiff here 15 years, he said. "Hargrove fined people with religious symbols 3 times more than other violations. I counted, once in a day, he hit 5 people for crosses, but ignored 3 in vulgar shirts." Linda jotted notes fast, her team cross-checking with official records. The data soon emerged. Over the past year, 70% of religious symbol fines targeted Christians, averaging 200 to 150, double the penalty for other dress code breaches. Hargrove's resignation. Charles Hargrove, meanwhile, sat in his home office, facing the council via Zoom. "I didn't mean to be biased," he said, his voice weak, hands cradling his head. Linda presented the data. "Mr. Hargrove, records show you fine people wearing crosses 80% more harshly than similar violations. How do you explain that?" Hargrove fell silent, eyes downcast. He recalled Karoline, her steely voice, her sharp reasoning about the First Amendment. "I didn't realize," he mumbled. "I thought I was maintaining order." By noon, Linda's preliminary report was complete. "This isn't just Hargrove," she told the council. "We found 3 other D.C. judges with similar tendencies, though milder. But Hargrove is the clearest case, bias against religion, especially Christianity." The council ordered Hargrove's immediate suspension, pending a final ruling. The fallout news leaked out, and X erupted again. Number sign cross in court, Hargrove suspended. Karoline Levit shakes the system. A conservative account posted, "Trump's legal genius wins again." Karoline stood before the mirror in the White House briefing room at 6 p.m., adjusting her blazer. The cross still gleamed. Trump walked in, clapping her shoulder. "You made me proud, Karoline. Tonight we show them. Religious freedom is untouchable." She nodded, stepping to the podium. Camera flashes fired nonstop. "Yesterday I was fined for wearing a cross, not because I was wrong, but because a judge thought he was above the law," she said, her voice resonating. "I fought back, not just for me, but for everyone treated unfairly for their faith." The press crowd buzzed, questions flying. but she answered calmly, citing law and X data. Hargrove's redemption. Hargrove watched the briefing on TV, hands trembling. He turned it off, sitting in darkness. His phone overflowed with messages, colleagues distancing themselves, reporters hounding him. But what shocked him most was Thompson and Wilson's testimony, people he trusted. He opened his laptop, searching the church of Lukumi Babaluai, ruling Karoline mentioned. Reading it, he sighed. She's right. I was wrong. For the first time in 30 years, Hargrove felt small. He called the council, voice hoarse. I'm resigning, but I want to help fix this. The legacy. The next day, Hargrove appeared at a small council meeting, no longer in a judge's robe. I didn't see my own bias, he said, eyes red. Karoline Levit opened my eyes. I want to join the training, so no one repeats my mistakes. Linda nodded, noting Hargrove's turning around could be useful. The news spread, sparking debate. Some on X mocked Hargrove, faking it, but others supported. At least he admits fault. Rare. Karoline, back in her office, got an email from Linda. Hargrove resigned, agreed to train. You changed him. She glanced at the cross in the mirror, smiling. The case she'd come to observe, the Christian group suing the government, was now just a small part of a bigger story. She'd turned an ordinary day into a spark for change. Not just for Hargrove, but for the whole system. Final thoughts. Just 4 days after the incident at the D.C. local court, the atmosphere in Washington shifted noticeably. Karoline Levit stood in her White House office, gazing out the window at Pennsylvania Avenue. The silver cross on her navy blazer collar still shone, now a symbol of a movement bigger than she'd imagined. Her phone buzzed with messages from Trump, conservatives, and everyday people thanking her for speaking up. An email from the D.C. Judicial Council had just arrived. New regulations. Thank you, Miss Levit, it read. She smiled, knowing this victory wasn't hers alone. The end Karoline Levit's story reminds us that freedom doesn't come free. It takes fighters. From one unexpected day, she reshaped laws, inspired others, and proved one person, one belief, can shake the world.